both Rousseau and Hobbes were essentially talking through their hats in the sense that they didn't have any empirical evidence to back up their claims, but they never wanted, they were not necessarily interested in the empirical evidence, even though later on people wanted to turn to them and say, aha, they were talking about people in a state of nature. And as we talked about in the last class, in some ways, anthropology could fashion itself to be an answer to this Rousseau versus Hobbes debate. What were people basically like in a state of nature? Were they essentially good? Were they nice to each other? Or were they essentially mean in the war of all against all? And for many anthropologists, as we talked about in the last class, they kind of went with the Rousseau tradition. And so the volume on Man the Hunter by Richard Lee was based upon anthropological studies, and as Graeber and Wengrow put it, many anthropologists who kind of lean toward Rousseau, lean toward people being good, like to study foragers, hunters and gatherers in Africa, like the Hadza, the Pygmies, or the Kung. Can't do that, but there's a click at the beginning of that. And that's the people, the Kung are the people that Richard Lee was studying when he wrote about how, in fact, according to his measurements, they didn't have to work very long in order to get the necessities of life, that they were essentially egalitarian, that there wasn't a lot of hierarchies, and that in fact they were basically not a violent society, even though they did not have a state. And so this led Jared Diamond to summarize that agriculture was the worst mistake in the history of the human race. And I think that Graeber and Wengrow says that those anthropologists who tend toward Rousseau prefer to study African foragers, but there's another reason why you might want to think that that would be a good idea, which is that, as we know from human evolution and biological anthropology, most of the good stuff in human evolution happens in Africa. And so it would be natural to assume that the hunting and gathering traditions in Africa would most represent what people were doing in what we might consider the early stages of human development. And so we talked also about how for Jared Diamond later on, he would say, well, you know, agriculture may be the greatest mistake we made, but if we want to really run a modern society, a society that supports lots of people, we need a state government. So what can we learn from traditional societies? We can learn that, yeah, they had some great things, but in fact, to run our modern society, we need a state. So he can remain basically a Rousseau person. People are basically good, but he also gets to have the idea that, well, you can't do things without, you can't support the large populations and organize ourselves without a state. So his position becomes relatively similar to Hobbes. Now, Hobbes, of course, would say that the people in a state of nature are in the war of all against all. And if you want to turn, if you want to find an anthropologist who basically supports the Hobbesian position, you would turn not to the African foragers, but to the work of Napoleon Chagnon on the Yanomamö, who he called the fierce people. And you would turn to a very famous film that he made called The Axe Fight. Anybody ever, were you shown this film in an anthropology class ever? Anybody read Napoleon Chagnon? Any of your anthropology dealings? Curious. This book became kind of a standard for, say, high school social studies for a long time. This would be like what you read. He became one of the most popular and well-known anthropologists. And I used to show the axe fight as well. It's a really interesting film. I actually looked for a copy, but it's difficult to get streaming these days. Liz, you were interested in this person, Napoleon Chagnon. What did you find out about him? Yeah, he became very controversial. People made some wild claims about him, and if you want to start a fight in anthropology, probably still to this day, he's a good person you can name. Like I said, he became a standard for high school and early, what you would read in your early anthropological curriculum. As Graeber and Wengrow put it, he wasn't necessarily trying to make the claim that this was the representative of primordial or basic human societies. As you can see, the society he was studying was in South America, and they were horticulturalists. They weren't actually hunter-gatherers. They grew things, and I mean, they did hunting, but they also were cultivators. But he did portray this as a kind of non-state society. And so and then these films were very graphic and captivating, and he was a kind of an Indiana Jones type figure, you might say, to use an older reference that's probably slipping out of our minds. Although I think Indiana Jones is coming back. They're going to make him look young again. Or that actor, Harrison Ford, looked young again for another Indiana Jones. But he had a kind of bravado to him, and he did. It's when you watch the axe fight, he basically claims that because the villages are getting so large, they're going to have these conflicts. And for me, it's kind of interesting because if you watch the axe fight, at first you're very kind of persuaded by the people fighting each other part of it. But as he goes through, you realize that there's all these social controls that are being put in place upon the actions that people are taking. So it's kind of strange to me that he's become the poster anthropologist, he's now passed away, for the idea that people in a natural state are Hobbesian and violent. But certainly Steven Pinker has taken him to be that kind of person for him. So Steven Pinker bursts onto the scene. I think this is in the 1980s. His first big book was called The Blank Slate: The Denial of Human Nature in Modern Intellectual Life. And so he was on a tear, Steven Pinker was. He was on a tear against the people who were denying human nature. Now, who are the people who might be denying human nature in modern intellectual life? What kind of, who was he most mad at, do you think? Huh? The people who would be the most denying that there was such an absolute thing as human nature. You may have met some of these people along the way in your studies. Who was he mad at? The teachers. Yeah, he's mad at the teachers. He said that the teachers are poisoning the youth with their bad teachings, telling people there isn't such a thing as human nature and that it's more about culture. What kind of people would be doing this? What kind of teachers? Gabe. Anthropology teachers, that's right. We're the ones that are always saying that, oh no, it's not some sort of baseline human nature. We're very flexible. You know, we have different cultures. So yeah, he got really down on anthropologists, man. Boaz, Benedict Mead, he was on a tear. Didn't like us at all. So that was his bursting on the scene. And as you can see it, there's that little baby's blue eyes staring at you saying, I do have a human nature, I do, and I'm gonna get you. Because his later book, his much more famous book, and when he became Steven Pinker, one of the most well-read people, most read people, partly because Bill Gates loves him. The Better Angels of Our Nature, the Decline of Violence in History and Its Causes, which basically says that violence is going down, decline of violence. I know, as our authors say, anybody reading the news, it's like, what? Huh? Are we looking at the same world? And he would say that, he'd marshal a bunch of statistics and he'd say, well, yeah, you read it in the news now, but it's only because we have the news. And if you do it as a percentage of the population, it's less. And man, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Huh? Yeah, again, he'd probably say, well, in the old, I don't know what Pinker would say. I can't support his viewpoint, but he'd probably say, well, look what happened in the old days. It would cause a world war, but now it's just limited to Ukraine, so it's great. I don't know, he basically says that he's a Hobbesian in the fact that he, believes that people were once violent. And as a Hobbesian, he loves state governments. By the way, why do Hobbesians love state governments? Yeah. Yeah, because we're all crazy and about to kill each other all the time because we're living in a world that is nasty, brutish, and short. And so you got to be in your war of all against all. And so you need a state government to make them more polite, to keep you in line. Now, I just want to point out here, this is on page 13, where they say that Pinker loves one of the reasons he says that violence is declining, the logical outcome of living in sovereign states, right? I guess, of course he's not going to support the war in Ukraine because you're supposed to have your own sovereign state, each with a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence within its borders. So what this means is that, I should say that they don't even reference the person who first, or, who most said this, which was the sociologist Max Weber back in 1918, about 100 years ago, in a lecture called Politics as a Vocation. He called the state the human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And so this has become so commonplace of an idea that if you hear it, you don't necessarily have to quote Weber on this, but it's the Weberian view of the state, which is basically, well, let's say Let's say that if Cyrus comes up and punches me in the nose right now, do I have the right? What should I do? I do have the right to punch him back for a little bit of time. Can I shoot him? Kind of. It depends on where we are. In the United States, we've never had the Weberian idea of the state because people are always walking around with guns. But technically, in most societies where the state has the monopoly over the legitimate use of violence, I'm supposed to call the police. I might be able to punch back until the police come, and then I'm not supposed to punch anymore. I can defend myself. And I'm not supposed to shoot him just for punching me. That's not right. Unless he pulls out a gun and then I come on. You see what I'm saying? Even in the United States, I'm not supposed to do that. That's too much. Yeah, they do that. In most societies around the world, especially the European societies, you're not supposed to do this. You don't have a gun, and the police don't have guns either, so it's not a problem. Anyway, as you can see, the Weberian definition of the state has been called into question because a lot of states don't necessarily have this monopoly over the legitimate use of violence. But basically what Weber is saying is that if you have a successful state, only the state, the police or the army are the ones that are authorized to use violence, nobody else. So anyway, the point for Pinker and Chagnon is that if you don't have a state, if you don't have a country, if you don't have a state government regulating things, you end up in what Felicia on page 16 Felicia needs page numbers because she's PDFing things. On page 16 calls the Hobbesian trap. What is the Hobbesian trap, Felicia?
Like you shoot first, you don't have, so you don't get shots.
Oh, it's kind of like if, I think Cyrus is about to hit me, so I pull the trigger first. Yeah, you end up in this cycle, right? And in a Hobbesian trap, it's okay, maybe let's put, so in a Hobbesian, I don't know if I want to if I want to keep using Cyrus for this example, but now that I'm down this path, I might as well go. Cyrus punches me. I shoot Cyrus. In a Hobbesian trap, what happens then is that all of Cyrus's clan and kin are authorized to then take revenge on me because they have legitimate use of violence because, we're now in a revenge trap. You know what I mean? Where one group of kin has injured another, and now everybody is authorized to take revenge. You're in a spiral. I mean, I'm trying to think if we have this happen anymore. Does this happen in the United States? I feel like sometimes it does happen, but I think it's less common now, but the idea is, I think old ideas of gang violence, for example, right? It's that, hey, you took one of ours, we're going to take one of yours, and so the idea is the state comes in and regulates this, and the police say you can't just do one for one, you got to stop this all. Anyway, that's the Hobbesian trap. And according to Pinker and Hobbes, you need a state to stop it. Now, one of the things that Pinker has been accused of is archaeological cherry picking. Cherry picking examples. which has struck me. I all of a sudden started to wonder if you knew what cherry picking meant. What does it mean? If you accuse someone of cherry picking, what does it mean? Right. I was wondering if that, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if that, I suddenly thought about how difficult it sometimes might be to pick cherries all the time. If you're accusing someone of cherry picking, that might mean that they're just going through the orchard. But yes, it means picking just the nice ones out. So picking the good cherries. In when you're writing your papers, it's like, I'm only going to take the examples that support my thing. Anything else, I don't care about. So we actually, this guy over here, we've heard of, the Iceman, Ötzi the Iceman. You know about Ötzi? Yeah, what happened? Everybody knows about him, right? What happened to him? He died. Yeah, he dies. He gets frozen and he's got an arrow out of his side. So Pinker loves Ötzi because it's like, ooh, violence. We don't hear about is Romito too, right, Cyrus? Who's that? So, yeah, sort of archaeological evidence for a form of, yeah, genetic disorder, which would make you pretty useless, around the same time as the Iceman, but seems to have been taken care of, cared for, even though not useful. So what they say here, though, is if you want to say, oh, humans are naturally good, you pick off and talk about Romito too. And if you want to say humans are naturally bad, you talk about the Iceman. But actually, neither one of them, they're simply examples you can use. They both illustrate that humans are complex. And so in the same way that some people like to talk about the foragers in Africa versus the Yanomamö, people can always find an example of something that supports their argument. Pinker later wrote a book. I think this is, I forget what, he keeps writing books. Enlightenment Now, damn it. The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. As they say, things are getting better and better and better, and we just need to trust the reason, trust the science, trust the progress. It's going to get better. Matt, can we trust this guy? No, why not?
Says things like different ethnic groups commit violent crimes at different rates. It's like, that's kind of an assumption, and we don't really have anything to back that up, so how would I believe that anything that's
Yeah, I'm glad you found something that was, you know, he's a very popular character out there. A lot of people have read him, a lot of people like him, but yeah, I find him difficult to trust because of, like I said, the statements that he's made. He portrays himself as a enlightened centrist here. And don't get me wrong, I like science and I like reason and humanism and progress, but the question becomes, progress for whom, right? Who gets the progress? What is who benefits from this? As Matt put it, there, you know, is everyone equally benefiting here? You know, and who gets the progress and who gets left behind? And as I was searching on Pinker, I was reminded of this forum that he had with Napoleon Chagnon about human nature and all of these things. And, you know, it's like, are these the guys that get to tell us about what humans are like, right? It's like the classic, the classic people who are going to pronounce upon what human beings are like in their native state. We're going to gather together some prominent representatives of all of humanity to enlighten us on enlightenment. Yeah, it's a little bit, it makes you wonder what the perspective is. And I'm not saying that old white guys shouldn't be able to say anything. They should be able to say anything, but just, you know, have a little bit of humility. Now, getting back to Graeber and Wengrow on Pinker, they make the statement that there's another way to look at this, which is that when we look at the colonial history, when Europeans were colonizing, especially North America, they make the statement that the colonial history of North and South America is full of accounts of settlers captured or adopted by indigenous societies being given the choice of where they wish to stay and almost invariably choosing to stay with the latter. That is to say, they would almost always choose to stay with the indigenous societies rather than the European society. And they give the example of a person who was basically captured, Helena Valero, by the Yanomamö and experienced some pretty intense things, but eventually decided that she preferred life with the Yanomamö to life among the Europeanized Brazilians. So, I mean, there's been some debate about this. I read a review of Graeber and Wengrow that says that the source they cite doesn't support their claim. Looking into it, though, it is my perspective that it is true that that people were adopted and abducted into both indigenous societies and into the colonizer societies. This went in both directions. And usually the younger you were adopted, the more you became a part of that society, either way. So it wasn't necessarily in one direction or the other. But from what I can tell, I think that, and they cite Ben Franklin's piece here, it does seem that people who had the knowledge of both what was going on in the colonial society and what was going on in indigenous societies and had lived a little bit of time in both tended to, I would say that they usually did prefer. I'm reluctant to say almost invariably, but for various reasons, they seem to often like indigenous societies. And even if they, even if this was a half and half thing, if life in a state of indigenous society was as Pinker would have had it, which is nasty, brutish, and short, and the war of all against all, none of them would have preferred it, right? Everybody would prefer the colonial European society. So, I mean, it's an interesting kind of commentary on what was going on at the time, and will lead into, as we start reading the next chapter, what the critique or the attitude that the indigenous people of the Americas had toward the people that they were able to observe. Now, at the latter part of the chapter, Graeber and Wengrow begin to talk about a final part of their critique of these big ideas that come to us about the Rousseau versus Hobbes debate, and say that these conventional stories are not just wrong, but quite needlessly dull. So they give us the example of a story that is told to us by Adam Smith. By the way, when people say Adam Smith, what happens? What do you think of? Anything come to your mind? Hmm? Good. All right. Adam Smith is the author of The Wealth of Nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Published in 1776. You can always remember this because something else happened in 1776. All right. So, yeah, but in some ways, a hugely influential book. The reason they talk about Adam Smith here is because Adam Smith is like, in some ways, parallel to what Hobbes. So Hobbes decides that in a state of nature, people are in this cutthroat competition, the war of all against all. And what Adam Smith does is he says, I mean, for Hobbes, you needed this Leviathan state to like keep everybody polite. And what Adam Smith does is he says, well, or Adam Smith was smarter than a lot of the people who used him later. But he basically says that that's okay in the realm of economics. It's okay for people to compete against each other like this because the invisible hand is going to make it all work out. That if I follow my self-interest, and I might be a baker, and my self-interest is to sell bread, and your self-interest is to raise horses, then I'm going to sell you a horse, or you're going to sell me a horse, and I'm going to sell you the bread, and we're all following our self-interest, but the market competition makes it all work out. Now, like I said, Adam Smith was smarter than this. He also wrote a lot about that people needed to be educated a certain way. It couldn't just be, competition for competition's sake. But basically, this becomes the justificatory statement for why we need market capitalism. And if everybody just does their basic, follows human nature, everything's going to work out. And so Adam Smith was basically claiming that it is human nature to trade things around. And that, again, perhaps was smarter than this, but he's used to say that that leads to market competition, people trading things in markets, and therefore market capitalism becomes the inevitable great thing that it is. I think, Matt, you pulled another quote from Pinker about capitalism, right?
Capitalist societies are better than communist.
Yeah, there you go. It's always better under market capital. So capitalism becomes not only inevitable, it becomes the best system we ever had. So what they're trying to do here is they're talking about this in terms of the problem for archaeology and anthropologists, and the reason this becomes dull is because it does not reflect the way people and stuff actually gets around. And so what happens in the archaeological record is that people do move over long distances, and they do exchange things over long distances. But to call all of that trade and to act like this is just the precursor for capitalism and market societies is not what was happening in the archaeological and anthropological record. And so the first example they cite is one of the most famous anthropologists of all time, Bronislaw Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific, who describes something called the Kula ring or the Kula chain, in which armbands are moving in one direction and necklaces, shells are moving in the other direction, and they sail over distances to find each other and make these trades. And, it's an amazing network of exchanges, but has very little to do with what we might call market economies and money and all those things. I don't know, Felicia, if you remember the Kula ring from cultural anthropology a long time ago. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, you have those objects and yeah, exactly. Very good. Yeah. They also mentioned some things that happen in North America or in the Americas, especially North America, like vision quests, like seeing a dream and having to go out traveling around and trading possessions that way, that there were traveling healers and entertainers. And actually the one that I got most interested in is that the women were gambling stuff away and you could find things halfway across the continent that had been gambled. And so what they're saying is that sure, people may have traded things in that sense of it's human nature to truck and barter, as Adam Smith would say, but there's all kinds of other things going on and all kinds of crazy reasons why people travel and exchange things and how objects might get from place to place. And so their argument is that to find out what is really going on in past societies and in present societies, we have to do a better job interpreting the archaeological evidence. We can't just assume that because something shows up in a different place that must be an indication of market trade. We can't just assume that because people in one society seem to be warlike, that applies to all societies, or conversely, that because people seem to be peaceful in one society, that means Rousseau was right back thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So that's one huge thing that they're trying to do, is bring us new archaeological and ethnographic evidence. But the other huge thing that they're trying to do, and that's what we're going to be starting in the next chapter, in chapter 2, Wicked Liberty, is to turn to people who were thinking and writing about this, about these ideas from an indigenous tradition, what we might call indigenous intellectuals or indigenous theorists.